and welcome to another book without a barcode, where I will be reviewing Man Plus by Frederick Pohl. This was gifted to me by Ryan, so Ryan, thank you very much. And that is because I'm trying to read all the Nebula Award winners, and this book was published in 1976 and subsequently won the Nebula Award. So Ryan, again, thank you very much. And I am so grateful, mostly because this book surprised me as someone with a very neurospicy brain, as well as having past trauma. I have really strong pattern recognition, so to be surprised by a book is a special and novel thing for me, and somehow Frederick Pohl managed to do this in this very short, tight little bit of science fiction. And it was extra surprising because the foreshadowing in the beginning of the book is very heavy. Like, you understand what is going to happen to the main character, Roger Torroway, in the first third of the book. You understand that the Man Plus program is going to have a setback that is going to make Roger Torroway the target of the Man Plus program. And the Man Plus program is a secret government program where, instead of trying to make Mars, like terraform Mars or make Mars inhabitable to man, they are instead trying to make man capable of inhabiting Mars. So Mars has a lighter center of gravity. It also has a different air composition than Earth does. So they are changing man in order to make them be able to live on Mars. So in the Man Plus program, that means getting all of those squishy bits that function perfectly well on Earth and making them into cybernetic components that would be able to withstand the pressure or the lack of pressure, and also the chemical composition of the air on Mars. And this was published in, as I said, 1976. So it is far enough removed away from the original landing of the moon to where, you know, in 1969, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And there was so much, like, joy and optimism and presidential backing behind the space program, versus at the time all of America loved the space program, and it was far enough like removed from that time to where everyone was looking to Mars. Like, we conquered the moon, the United States is now going to conquer Mars next. So that seemed like the obvious next step for the space program, which is, this is very much a book of its time for multiple reasons, that being one of them. And it was before the changing of the focus of NASA. So they started to do the space shuttle program in the 80s, and then, you know, with the tragic accident in 1986, that kind of like completely changed how Americans viewed space. So I feel like I have to talk about this before I talk about the book. So if you're not here for that, totally understand. But, you know, the space shuttle program, what they were trying to do, NASA was trying to do, was trying to make it so they could have a returnable object. So if the space shuttle would go out and come back, and they could just continue to keep reusing that item instead of having like a single use item, which is what it was before. It was like, it would go out in space and then it would come back. They would learn lessons from that thing and then send a new thing out and then have it come back. And then it was never the same module. Versus space shuttle program, they wanted something that could repeatedly go out into space and come back, and go out into space and come back. And then the reason why that's so important is, one, for resources sake. There was a time of fast growth. I mean, the technological advances we have now versus then, it's amazing that the space shuttle flew into space, to be honest, if you think about it. And the reason why we don't have as much as a space focus now in 2024, which is when I'm filming this video, is, I think, in large part due to the accident that happened in 1986. In 1986, they decided to make space accessible to everyone, to show that space was accessible to everyone. Again, there's still a lot of positivity towards space, to like conquering space. Like, they wanted to make it so it wasn't just astronauts that could go into space. So they decided to train a teacher to go into space. And so they have an entire generation, well, technically 2 generations, because you have Gen X and you have millennials, well, the young generation, and then you had like the silent generation and the boomers. All of them watched this teacher with NASA doing all these press tours and stuff, saying like, you know, anybody can go into space. Look, this teacher's going to be going to space, you know, and they had all these schools watching this launch where they were going to make space accessible to everybody. And then that shuttle went up and exploded, which suddenly made space not accessible to everyone anymore. And since then, the funding for NASA has just steadily done this. And so when I read period fiction between this beautiful time between the mid 1960s to like the early 1980s, it's just so much optimism with what humanity can do with space. Completely in juxtaposition with why we're going to space, which is that humanity is going to destroy the planet, which, you know, we still are probably going to do that, but the reasons and the methods of destruction of the planet and why Earth is not going to be inhabitable anymore has changed drastically from that time period, which I was constantly reminded of while reading this book. It didn't make it less enjoyable, it just actually kind of made it a little bit more enjoyable with all that background information, which is why I felt that it was pertinent to share with you. The reason why this book is happening and the Man Plus project is happening is because it is the last savior for humanity. This is the one thing that's gonna unite the world at this time. The way this book is written, it feels like it's kind of taking place in the 1990s. Despite it being written in 1976. Again, we were at a lightning pace to space at this time period. Like the amount of technological advances happening between the Cold War, like between World War II to like the 1990s and even like in today. Like you would still say the technological advances are like this. And there's so much optimism to space, but there's so to where like this seemed very plausible at that time for that to happen in the 90s, where like we're gonna be able to make cyborgs, and we kind of are at this point in 2024. I mean, you see prosthetics. I mean, it's not at the level of Neuromancer by any stretch of the imagination, or even any stretch of the imagination for this book, but you have prosthetic limbs where people are able to like move and grab things that are by hydraulics and stuff, and are able to do brainwaves motions, so they're able to do small graspy things, but we're not like at Borg level of cybernetics. And the reason why we're doing the Man Plus program is because we've overpopulated the world at 8 billion people, which, by the way, we are close to 8 billion people, and I would not say that the world is overpopulated so much that we're crammed in little boxes, which is how people thought that the world would be at this point, and it's not. I mean, there are some people that are living in coffin apartments like in New York City and in Hong Kong and some parts of China and like some parts of India, but it's not a universal experience for humanity, and that is because they felt that that would have to happen. There would have to be a compression due to the fact that we would need all that land to do crops. Also, that compression that would happen with condensing of population would mean that the air quality was abysmal, because there would be all these factories that were producing things for this growing population, and it would just produce the smog. If you've ever seen pictures of what Los Angeles looked like in the 70s, you would understand, like, or New York, what New York and Los Angeles looked like in the 70s. You would totally understand their mentality, where, you know, Earth's going to become uninhabitable because the air quality is going to be crap, and then also like there are going to be too many people in the world, we're not going to be able to feed them. And it is much sexier for a science fiction writer to write about turning people into cyborgs over and exploring Mars or colonizing Mars, versus forming an environmental protection agency and regulating factories and emissions. And also creating genetically modified food to have larger crop yields. one of those is sexier to write about and more interesting in the science fiction space. And that, like I said, this is very much a product of a time for that reason. And I always find that amusing whenever I read these books and they talk about the reason why we're going into space is because you can't breathe on Earth and it's too crowded. And as I mentioned before, it's also a product of its time because we're still doing the Cold War at this time, and it's very much like a US versus it's very much like democracy versus communism still in this writing period. Basically the world powers is divided into 3 factions. You kind of have like Russia, you have China, and you have America. So like the 2 big communist powers versus America, and it's kind of like that thing going on. And the Man Plus program is going to unite humanity because we're all going to go to the stars. And we're no longer have to like scrabble for resources because humanity will then end up on Mars. And, you know, we'll have a new frontier to conquer, and we won't have this fight over resources or land, which is what a fight over resources, because the more land you control, the more resources you control. And so there was a little bit of that with the politics of the time period in this book, which is part of why I enjoyed the book, is because of all of the above, because I have all of that context as well when I'm reading this book. But what surprised me was the ending. I said before that Frederick Pohl's foreshadowing in the beginning of the book made you realize that it was an inevitability that the main character, Roger Torroway, who is an astronaut, was going to have to be, not just run the Man Plus program or be a part of the Man Plus program, but was going to be the Man Plus program due to the foreshadowing in the beginning of the book. I did not expect the ending, like the very last bit of the book, at all. I noticed there was a change of language, but I thought that that was not foreshadowing. I thought that that was maybe some colloquialism of language of the time period, because, you know, I was not born yet in the 70s. I was not thought of yet in the 70s. I was not an inkling of a hope in the 70s. So I thought maybe that was just some kind of language that was happening, because, you know, when I read some of these older science fiction books, there is outdated language. A grand example of that would be like Einstein Intersection, when they're talking about cool cats and hip dudes and that kind of stuff, which is still a language I have a reference to because I've watched some period pieces. But there's all those little idiosyncrasies with different areas of the United States even now, to where maybe it was something that I just wasn't getting because this takes place out in the West and I live in Virginia. So I thought maybe it was just a colloquialism of that thing, but it turned out to be super important to the ending of the book. And I just want to say that, like, first of all, the book, I did not expect this when I started reading, especially with the big gender stereotypes that are throughout this book. I did not expect to enjoy it as much as I did, and I did not expect for it to engage me as much as I did. It's very well paced, it's very well written, and like I said, it kept my rapt attention. I read this one sitting, just all the way through, all 4 hours, all the way through. Did not want to put it down, just because, like, I was there, I was reading it, I wanted to see where it goes. And then when I got to the ending, I was like, you did it. You did something that hasn't been done to me in a exceptionally long time. So Frederick Pohl, hats off to you for that. I do highly recommend Man Plus as a book overall. I can definitely see why this won the Nebula Award. It is super interesting as far as where they thought the technology was going to go at a time. It is super interesting as far as politics goes. It's super interesting as far as the dynamics between all of the humans in the book goes. And then it does have the ability to surprise you at the end. So thank you again, Ryan, for allowing me to own this beautiful book, because I will be keeping this. It is a hardcover. And I hope that you all will have an opportunity to read this sometime in the future if you are so inclined. But thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, bye!